if you think about it, all systems are made up of thousands of species, especially in the soils and in the plants, microbes. And they're not there just because of chance. They're there because they're integrated with other species. And for that to happen, there has to be rules for what organizes the system. This is an incredibly difficult thing to study. Now, we started work in Serengeti about 50 years ago. And of course, we were not asking those kind of questions in those days. We were asking much more simple questions. And we started work at that time on looking at individual species. In our case, we were looking at the large mammals. And we were asking the first questions about how do individual populations stay in the way they are and not go extinct, or go into huge population increases and collapses. And so those were the original kinds of questions we were asking, and we were finding answers to those questions. It turned out, however, of course, that as we proceeded, we began to notice other events taking place that were not consistent with what we thought were the answers. And so we found, of course, that we hadn't really got the whole story, and in some cases we'd actually got the story wrong. One nice example was that initially we discovered that large populations of animals like the wildebeest, which is the great migration of the biggest migration in the world, their numbers were determined by how much food there was. And we could show this quite nicely because they're large, and we were able to get the evidence for this. But then we discovered that when we were looking at other species, many other types of antelopes that are very similar, very closely related to the wildebeest, that they were not behaving in the way we would expect them to behave if food supply was what was limiting their numbers. In fact, they were behaving in exactly the opposite way. And that was the first indication that we hadn't quite got the story right. And that led us on to studying predators and predation, and discovered, of course, that a whole lot of species were not limited by their food supply, but were in fact limited by predators. In itself, we then discovered that the predator populations were themselves influenced by the great migration of wildebeest. At one point, one might ask, why weren't the predators just simply focusing on the huge numbers, 1.5 million animals of the wildebeest? And it turns out that we discovered predators can't migrate, but their prey can. And that means that for half the year, the predators don't have the migration available to them, and that means that they have to then focus on the other species which are not migrating. And so that brings in, ties in how the migration fits into this story. That led us on to understanding how food supply is integrated with disease. And that the disease story, in fact, was one of the great changes that took place in our system. So one of the themes in the book is change over the whole system has allowed us to interpret how the world works. Now this, over a period of 50 years, has allowed us eventually to piece together this detective story of different bits of the jigsaw puzzle, fit it all together to show how the whole system is integrated and is in fact driven by the Great Migration.